beginning to take root in that part of the world as well. A much more vigorous form of mixed race interaction that you find in other parts of the world. It's a different tradition coming out of Southern European colonization, Portuguese on one hand, Spanish on the other, and out of this a greater willingness to engage in forms of mixed interaction, mixed intercourse, and identified and acknowledged mixed race populations emerging. And out of this you get, in the last 30 years, really 1760 to 1790, in Mexico City in particular, but you also get versions of this in Peru and elsewhere, of what comes to be called casta painting, mixed race painting, caste painting you might even call it, which characterizes in explicit classificatory terms. And after all, classification is an emergent form of rationality of Enlightenment thinking. And that casta painting lays out the forms of offspring that emerge from certain kinds of mixture between what they call Spaniard and Indian on the one hand, Spaniard and black on the other. In other words, European or white, with other racial forms, Indian and African, and then mixtures as well with the mixtures of the mixtures, so to speak. So you get various gradations, and you might even call it degradations, of racial mixing that go from mestizo and so on.
That the color lines were not rigidly drawn between just two races, but you had at least one intermediate race, in mulattoes or brown people. The presence of the mulatto in those colonies, the importance of mulattoes in Brazil as an intermediate group, the importance of mestizos in Spanish colonies with a large Indian population, is something that I think does distinguish the United States with its basically two-category system. You're either white or you're black.
South America is very complex and fascinating. It's different, but it wasn't necessarily better. It's easy to be fooled by the system because you go there and you see blacks and whites among the poor mixing together, whereas they don't in the United States. Because what the U.S. did with this one-drop rule was to encourage a sense of solidarity among whites as a way of dividing them from blacks. And one reason you never had working-class solidarity in America is because the one-drop rule and the binary system of race is a powerful tool for dividing the working classes, between whites and blacks. And the lower down the system you go, the more economically vulnerable and marginal the white person is, the more he's inclined to be racist, because it's the only way in which he has some status. He's, at least I'm not black. And so the white poor and the black poor are totally against each other. So it became a perfect system of division. Latin American societies are far more racist at the top than the United States. I mean, the Brazilian military brass is completely white. The Brazilian political elite is, until recently, completely white. Whereas in the United States, the higher up you go now, because of civil rights laws and so on, the more integrated the population, and the American political elite is thoroughly integrated. I mean, the Secretary of State is black. You know, the Congressional Black Caucus is very powerful. Part of the reason for this is that the way black Americans took over the one-drop rule and turned it to their own ends for mobilization and solidarity. Whereas in Brazil, they go on about their racial democracy. All they mean by that is that white men were going to bed with black women and not feeling guilty about it, and producing mixed kids whom they great beauty queens. But the system remained viciously unequal. Brazil is the most unequal society in the Western world, and blacks are completely at the bottom. So it's a pernicious system. It's apartheid without apartheid laws. And at the top, it's thoroughly racist.
If contemporary democracies can be called racist, then it should come as no surprise that over 200 years ago, a very early democratic experiment in Sierra Leone went badly wrong. Freetown became the home of the black loyalists, ex-slaves who freed themselves by fighting for the British in the American War of Independence. But their freedom turned out to be very limited because of the dictates of their former British masters.
To some extent, what's interesting about Sierra Leone is how accidental the whole story is. These people, in a sense, have become refugees and have become British because they'd actually crossed the lines during the American Revolution to fight for the British. So in 1775, the British governor of Virginia said that if black people who were slaves would cross lines, would leave their plantations, leave the Americans, if you like, and fight for him, for the British, they'd win their freedom. But the British weren't committed in any deep way during the American Revolution to racial equality or even to emancipation. It was a strategic military move.
When this colony was established in 1787, it was meant to be a free colony. But for a variety of reasons, it didn't work that way. The problems with the colony inhabitants really came to the forefront with the arrival of the Nova Scotian settlers. These were blacks who had helped the British during the American War of Independence, and they had been promised some land in Nova Scotia. They were called the Black Loyalists. Many of the promises that the British made to them were never fulfilled.
The tragedy of Sierra Leone in the 1790s is the difficulty, the almost impossibility, I guess, for whites of letting black people run the colony. I mean, it was constantly run by or overseen by white people. And black people, I think, didn't think that's how it was going to work out. They imagined they'd have much, much more power and authority. They wouldn't just be electing constables, they'd be running the colony. And that didn't happen.
These Nova Scotian settlers that came here had all the resources that would enable them to govern themselves as an independent people. They had black pastors, they had black politicians who had mobilized them in Canada to move over to Sierra Leone. So they really had the human resource to be able to govern themselves as a free and independent people.
You have a view that emerges at the same time and fuels abolitionism, the claim that those who are not European or of European descent are historically immature by contrast with those who are European or European settlers. Europeans see themselves as having the obligation, the burden to civilize. So I think it's still with us today. One sees it in relation to the invasion of Iraq, for example. We will come in and teach you how to govern yourselves because you haven't been able to govern yourselves hitherto.
It was really a great opportunity that was lost, because had these people been given the opportunity to govern themselves, it is possible that perhaps Sierra Leone would never have been colonized in the real sense of the word, and Sierra Leone could probably have been the first black African country to be free of colonial rule.
I believe there are a few events in my life which have not happened to many.
Olaudah Equiano, whose first slave name was Gustavo Vassa, obtains his freedom in London and becomes a key figure in the abolitionist movement. His autobiography really becomes the transforming political document to the abolitionist movement.
Olaudah Equiano is just one of the great campaigners consigned to the margins of history, while William Wilberforce is represented as the all-conquering hero who abolished slavery. However, no matter which great abolitionists you choose, you will find even greater forces behind them, from the radical Christianity of the Quakers to the workers forming what would become the trades union movement.
The other thing about Equiano was he's the one who connected the artisans of the London Corresponding Society in 1792. He connected them with the steel workers, the coal miners, and the factory workers of Sheffield. And it was this conjunction of the industrial proletariat and the artisans of London, which historians have often seen as the beginning of the English working class as a whole. But it was Olaudah Equiano who had brought them together.
The period where you see the most solidarity between enslaved Africans and the white working class, in Britain anyway, I think were the early years of the abolition movement. Starting in the late 1780s, hundreds of thousands of Britons signed petitions to Parliament against the slave trade. And amazingly, a lot of these petitions came from workers. There were 769 metal workers in Sheffield who signed a remarkable petition to Parliament that said, in effect, you might expect us to be in favor of the slave trade because we sell a lot of the wares we make to the captains of slave ships who use them as trading goods to buy slaves in Africa, but we want to express our solidarity with our African brethren, and we are told that they do not wish to be slaves.
It's a very slow movement, a kind of shifting of the kind of